Margaret Rodriguez never thought she'd miss the chaos of courtrooms and late-night case reviews. After 35 years climbing through the ranks of the state's legal system, she had finally reached the top as Attorney General. But by 62, she was ready for something different. Something quiet. Her ranch sat on 40 beautiful acres outside Millbrook County, far enough from the city that she couldn't hear traffic, close enough that she could still drive to town for groceries. The property had been in foreclosure when she found it 3 years ago. The previous owners couldn't keep up with the mortgage after the husband got sick. Margaret saw potential where others saw problems. The farmhouse dated back to the 1920s, built by a family who raised cattle and grew corn. Margaret spent 2 years restoring it herself, learning skills she never needed in her legal career. She replaced rotted floorboards, painted walls, and even fixed the old stone chimney. Every weekend was a new project, and she loved every minute of it. The horse stables came next. Margaret had always wanted horses, but never had time or space. Now she had both. She started with 2 rescue horses, both older animals that nobody else wanted. Thunder was a former racehorse whose best days were behind him. Daisy was a gentle mare who'd been neglected by her previous owner. They deserved a peaceful retirement too. Soon word spread that Margaret's ranch was a safe place for unwanted animals. People brought her chickens that couldn't lay eggs anymore, goats that were too old for breeding, and even a pig named Biscuit who'd grown too big for his suburban backyard. Her property became a sanctuary where animals could live out their days, in peace. Margaret's daily routine was simple and satisfying. She woke up at sunrise not because an alarm forced her to, but because the rooster did his job every morning at 6. She'd make coffee in her kitchen while watching the sun come up over the pasture. Then she'd walk outside to feed everyone. The chickens always greeted her first, running toward the fence when they saw her coming with their breakfast. Thunder and Daisy would be waiting by the stable door, knowing she'd bring them fresh hay and oats. Biscuit would grunt happily from his pen, and the goats would climb on everything they could find, just happy to see her. After taking care of the animals, Margaret would tend to her vegetable garden. She'd never grown her own food before retiring, but it turned out she had a natural gift for it. Tomatoes, corn, peppers, and squash grew better than she ever expected. She had so much extra produce that she set up a small stand at the end of her driveway with a simple sign, "Fresh vegetables, honor system, leave money in the box." Neighbors loved stopping by for her tomatoes and corn. Mrs. Patterson from down the road said Margaret's vegetables were the best she'd ever tasted. Even teenagers on their way to school would stop to buy apples for lunch money. The little stand became a neighborhood gathering spot where people would chat about weather, local news, and how their own gardens were doing. Evenings were Margaret's favorite time. She'd sit on her wraparound porch with a book, usually a legal thriller that reminded her of her old cases but didn't stress her out. The horses would graze in the pasture while the sun set behind the hills. Everything was peaceful and perfect. For 2 whole years, life was exactly what Margaret had dreamed about. No political pressure, no media attention, no difficult cases keeping her awake at night. Just animals, vegetables, and the kind of quiet that only comes from being far away from everything. Then the first letter arrived on a Tuesday in March. Margaret almost threw it away without reading it. The envelope looked like junk mail with a return address she didn't recognize. Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association. She figured it was some kind of advertisement or fundraising request, but something made her open it anyway. The letter was polite but confusing. It thanked her for being part of the Millbrook Estates community and reminded her about community guidelines that she needed to follow. It mentioned something about landscape standards and architectural approval for any changes to her property. Margaret read it twice, then laughed out loud. Her ranch had been here for almost a century. The HOA development was only 5 years old, built on land that used to be empty fields across the county road from her property. How could they have any authority over her land? She tossed the letter in the trash and forgot about it. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was less polite. It stated that her chicken coops were not in compliance with community standards and needed to be relocated or removed within 30 days. It also mentioned that her vegetable stand required prior approval for commercial activities in residential areas. This time, Margaret didn't laugh. She pulled out the first letter from the trash and read both more carefully. Someone at this HOA actually thought they had control over her property. As a retired attorney general, she knew exactly how property law worked. Her ranch had been here long before any HOA existed, which meant they had absolutely no legal authority over what she did on her own land. She decided to ignore the second letter too. Surely once they realized their mistake, they'd leave her alone. But the letters kept coming. Each one was more demanding than the last. They wanted her to paint her barn a different color because red wasn't on their approved palette. They said her solar panels needed to be HOA-approved models, even though hers were installed 2 years before their development existed. They even complained that her rescue animals were agricultural use in a residential zone. The fine started in May, $25 for the chicken coops, $50 for the vegetable stand, $100 for failure to respond to previous notices. By July, they claimed she owed over $3,000 in fines and fees. Margaret had dealt with plenty of legal bullies in her career, but this was different. These people weren't just wrong about the law. They seemed to truly believe they had authority over her property. She started researching the HOA, looking up their incorporation documents and trying to understand how they could possibly think her ranch fell under their control. What she found made her angry. The HOA had filed paperwork claiming a boundary adjustment that supposedly brought her property into their jurisdiction. The documents were professionally prepared and filed with the county, but Margaret could see they were based on incorrect property descriptions and false claims about when her ranch was purchased. Someone was either incredibly incompetent or deliberately trying to steal authority over her property. Given her experience with legal fraud, Margaret suspected it wasn't incompetence. By August, she wasn't laughing anymore. The letters had become certified mail that she had to sign for. The fines had grown to over $8,000. Worst of all, she'd received a notice that the HOA was considering placing a lien on her property for unpaid fees and non-compliance with community standards. Margaret realized this wasn't going to go away on its own. Someone at this HOA had decided to target her property, and they weren't going to stop until she fought back. But she had no idea just how far they were willing to go to try to control her peaceful little ranch. The battle lines were drawn, and Margaret Rodriguez was about to discover that retirement didn't mean she was done fighting for what was right. The man who stepped out of the black SUV looked like he owned the world. Harrison Blackwell wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his gray hair was perfectly styled. He carried a leather clipboard and walked with the confidence of someone who expected everyone to do exactly what he said. Margaret was filling water troughs for her horses when she noticed him at her front gate. She didn't recognize him, but something about the way he stood there taking pictures of her property made her uncomfortable. When he saw her watching, he smiled and waved like they were old friends. "Ms. Rodriguez," he called out as he walked up her driveway without permission. "I'm Harrison Blackwell, president of the Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I think it's time we had a conversation." Margaret wiped her hands on her jeans and walked over to meet him. Up close, she could see he was the type of man who was used to getting his way. His smile was too wide and his eyes were calculating. She'd met plenty of people like him during her years as Attorney General. "Mr. Blackwell," she said politely, "I'm not sure what we need to discuss. My property isn't part of your HOA. His smile got bigger but somehow less friendly. "Well, that's where you're wrong. According to our records, the boundary adjustment we filed last year brought your property under our jurisdiction. I'm here to help you understand what that means." Margaret crossed her arms. "And what exactly does it mean?" Blackwell pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of her chicken coops. "It means these need to go. Chickens aren't allowed in residential areas. Same with that pig over there." He pointed at Biscuit, who was happily rolling in mud. "Agricultural animals violate our community standards." "Those are rescue animals," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice calm. "And this property has had farm animals for almost a century." "Not anymore," Blackwell said, walking toward her vegetable garden. He took more pictures, making notes on his clipboard. "This commercial vegetable operation also needs to shut down. The stand at the end of your driveway is running a business without proper permits. Margaret watched him photograph her tomatoes and corn like they were evidence at a crime scene. That's not a business. I just share extra vegetables with neighbors. You have a money box. That makes it commercial. Blackwell walked back toward her house, taking pictures of everything. Her solar panels, her barn, even her mailbox. These solar panels aren't HOA-approved models. The barn needs to be painted beige or tan, not red, and that mailbox doesn't match community standards. Community standards for a community I'm not part of, Margaret said. Blackwell stopped walking and looked at her directly. Ms. Rodriguez, I know you used to be somebody important, but that was then. This is now. You live in Millbrook Estates whether you like it or not. You can cooperate with us or we can make things very difficult for you. The threat was clear, even though he said it with that same fake smile. Margaret had been threatened by much scarier people than Harrison Blackwell, but something about his confidence bothered her. He really seemed to believe he had power over her property. After he left, Margaret called the county clerk's office to get copies of the boundary adjustment documents Blackwell mentioned. What she found made her furious. The HOA had filed paperwork, claiming her property was part of a larger parcel that had been subdivided. The documents were full of legal language that would confuse most people, but Margaret could see they were based on false information. The problem was that even though the documents were wrong, they'd been officially filed. That gave the HOA some legal standing to claim authority over her property, at least until she could prove the documents were fraudulent. And proving fraud takes time, something the HOA clearly knew. Over the next few weeks, more people started showing up at Margaret's ranch. They claimed to be HOA inspectors, compliance officers, and community representatives. They took pictures, measured distances, and made lists of everything they claimed violated HOA rules. One woman spent an entire afternoon counting Margaret's chickens and taking photos of each one. She said chickens were limited to 6 per property, and Margaret had 18. Another man measured the height of her fence posts and declared they were 3 inches too tall. Someone else complained that her horses were too close to the property line. The citations started piling up. Margaret would find official-looking documents tucked under her windshield wipers, taped to her front door, or slipped through her mailbox slot. Each one listed new violations and added more fines to her growing total. They said her vegetable garden was too big for residential use. Her compost pile was a health hazard. Her gravel driveway needed to be paved with HOA-approved materials. Even her porch swing was wrong because it was blue instead of an approved color. By October, the HOA claimed Margaret owed over $15,000 in fines and fees. They sent her a certified letter saying they were placing a lien on her property and would begin foreclosure proceedings if she didn't pay immediately. That's when things got really scary. Men in uniform started showing up near her property. They wore official-looking badges and drove cars that looked like police vehicles from a distance. They called themselves Millbrook Community Enforcement and said they were there to monitor compliance with HOA regulations. These guards would park across the road from Margaret's driveway and just watch. They'd take pictures of everyone who visited her property, including Mrs. Patterson when she came to buy tomatoes. They'd write down license plate numbers and follow delivery trucks that brought feed for Margaret's animals. The horses hated it. Thunder and Daisy were rescue animals who'd been mistreated before Margaret saved them. Having strangers watching them all the time made them nervous and skittish. Even Biscuit the pig seemed stressed, staying close to his shelter instead of wandering around his pen like usual. Margaret's neighbors started acting differently, too. People who used to stop by her vegetable stand began driving past without making eye contact. Mrs. Patterson apologized but said she couldn't buy vegetables anymore because some people had told her it might cause problems with the HOA. Then, Margaret found out why her neighbors were scared. The HOA had sent letters to everyone within a mile of her ranch. The letters claimed that Margaret's non-compliant property was lowering everyone's home values. They said her farm animals were a health risk, and her commercial vegetable operation was illegal. The letters encouraged neighbors to file formal complaints against Margaret with the county health department, zoning board, and code enforcement office. They even provided pre-written complaint forms that people just had to sign and mail. Most of her neighbors knew the complaints were ridiculous, but they were scared of what might happen if they didn't cooperate. The HOA had made it clear that anyone who supported Margaret might become their next target. Margaret started getting visits from county inspectors who'd received anonymous complaints. They had to investigate every complaint, even obvious fake ones. A health inspector came to check her animals for diseases they clearly didn't have. A zoning officer measured her vegetable garden to see if it qualified as commercial farming. A code enforcement officer examined her barn to see if it needed construction permits. All the inspectors found exactly what Margaret expected. Nothing wrong. Her animals were healthy, her garden was clearly personal use, and her barn had been grandfathered in decades before any current codes existed. But each inspection took time and caused stress for both Margaret and her animals. The fake security guards got bolder. They started walking along the road in front of Margaret's property, taking pictures through her fence. One day she caught them trying to open her mailbox. When she confronted them, they claimed they were checking for unauthorized mail delivery to a non-compliant address. Margaret realized this wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. Someone was running a systematic campaign to force her off her property. They were using legal paperwork, fake authority, and intimidation tactics to make her life so difficult that she'd give up and move away. But Margaret Rodriguez hadn't spent 35 years fighting corrupt politicians and white-collar criminals just to be bullied off her own land by a power-hungry HOA president. She'd been patient long enough. It was time to fight back. What she didn't know was that Harrison Blackwell and his associates were about to make a mistake so big that it would destroy everything they'd worked for. They were about to forget that their target wasn't just some random homeowner they could push around. They were about to remember exactly who Margaret Rodriguez used to be. The morning started like any other Tuesday in October. Margaret woke up at sunrise, made her coffee, and walked outside to check on her animals. Thunder and Daisy were waiting by the stable door like always, and the chickens came running when they saw her with their breakfast bucket. Everything seemed normal and peaceful. She was in the barn cleaning out Thunder's stall when she heard car doors slamming in her driveway. That was unusual. Most visitors honked or called out when they arrived. Margaret peeked out the barn door and saw something that made her stomach drop. 3 men in what looked like police uniforms were walking toward her barn. Behind them sat a white patrol car with light bars on top and official-looking decals on the doors. From where Margaret stood, it looked exactly like a real police car. But something felt wrong immediately. In her 35 years working with law enforcement, Margaret had developed an instinct for when things weren't quite right. These men moved differently than real police officers. Their uniforms looked almost right, but not quite. And most importantly, she knew every police department in the county, and there was no such thing as the Millbrook Community Police Department that was written on their car. The man in front, who looked like he was in charge, called out to her. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you. Please come out of the barn with your hands visible." Margaret stepped outside but stayed near the barn door. "Can I help you, officers?" "I'm Sergeant Davis with the Millbrook Community Police," the leader said. He was a big man with a shaved head, and the kind of attitude that said he expected people to do whatever he told them. "We have multiple warrants for your arrest on charges of violating community ordinances and failure to comply with lawful orders." Margaret almost laughed. Violating community ordinances wasn't something you got arrested for, especially not by police. That was a civil matter handled by courts, not criminal law. But she kept her face serious and asked, "Can I see the warrants?" Sergeant Davis reached into his pocket and pulled out some folded papers. "Right here. You're under arrest. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." That's when Margaret knew for certain these weren't real police officers. Real cops would have let her read the warrants first. They also wouldn't arrest someone for HOA violations, which weren't criminal matters. And something about their badges looked wrong. The metal was too shiny and new, like they'd been bought from a costume shop. "Before I do anything," Margaret said calmly, "I need to see some proper identification. Your badge numbers, for instance." The fake sergeant's face got red. "Lady, we don't have time for games. You're coming with us right now." The other 2 men started moving closer to Margaret. One of them had handcuffs ready. They clearly expected her to panic and submit like probably every other person they'd tried this trick on. But Margaret Rodriguez had faced down drug dealers, corrupt politicians, and organized crime bosses. 3 fake cops in cheap uniforms didn't scare her. "Gentlemen," she said in the same calm voice she'd used in courtrooms for decades, "I need to inform you of something important. First, there is no Millbrook Community Police Department. I know every law enforcement agency in this county, and you're not it. Second, impersonating police officers is a felony under state law, punishable by up to 5 years in prison." The fake officers looked at each other uncertainly. This wasn't going the way they'd planned. Margaret continued, "Third, I am Margaret Rodriguez, retired Attorney General for this state. I've prosecuted dozens of cases involving people who impersonated law enforcement officers. I know exactly what crimes you're committing right now." Now the fake sergeant looked nervous, but he was too committed to back down. "I don't care who you used to be, lady, you're under arrest." "And fourth," Margaret said, pulling her phone out of her pocket, "I've been recording this entire conversation. Everything you've said and done is being uploaded to a secure server, in real time." That was actually a lie. She'd just started recording when she pulled out her phone, but they didn't know that. What she had done was discreetly press the emergency button on her security system before walking out of the barn. That button sent an automatic alert to the county sheriff's office with her exact location and a request for immediate assistance. The fake officers were getting more agitated by the second. They'd expected to find some frightened homeowner they could bully into submission. Instead, they'd walked into a trap set by someone who knew more about the law than they did. "Put that phone away," the fake sergeant demanded. "You're interfering with a police investigation." "What investigation?" Margaret asked. "HOA violations aren't criminal matters. You have no authority to arrest anyone for civil infractions. And even if you were real police officers, which you're clearly not, you'd need actual criminal charges to make an arrest." One of the other fake officers whispered something to the sergeant. Margaret couldn't hear what he said, but she could see panic spreading across their faces. They were starting to realize they'd made a terrible mistake. The sergeant made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "Ma'am, we have authority to make citizens arrests on behalf of the homeowners association. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back, or we'll have to use force." That's when Margaret knew they were really desperate. Citizens' arrest laws were very specific and didn't apply to civil violations like HOA disputes. These men were either completely ignorant of the law or hoping she was. "Gentlemen," Margaret said, "citizens' arrest only applies when you personally witness someone committing a felony. Growing vegetables and keeping chickens are not felonies. You have no legal authority to arrest me or anyone else." She could hear sirens in the distance now. Her security alert had worked, and real police officers were on their way. The fake officers heard the sirens too, and panic took over completely. "We need to go," one of them said to the sergeant. "This is going bad fast." But it was too late. 2 sheriff's department patrol cars came racing up Margaret's driveway with lights flashing and sirens wailing. Real police officers jumped out with their hands on their weapons, taking in the scene quickly. "Sheriff's Department," shouted Deputy Martinez, whom Margaret recognized from her days as Attorney General. "Everyone keep your hands where we can see them." The fake officers tried to act like they belonged there. "Officers, we're Millbrook. Community police. We were making an arrest when this woman became belligerent." Deputy Martinez looked at their uniforms and car, then looked at Margaret. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Deputy Martinez," Margaret said. "But these 3 men have been impersonating police officers and attempting to make an illegal arrest. I have the entire incident recorded on my phone." Sheriff Patricia Williams arrived a few minutes later. She and Margaret had worked together on several cases over the years, and she knew exactly who Margaret was and what she was capable of. "Maggie," the sheriff said, using Margaret's nickname, "what's the situation here?" Margaret explained everything while the fake officers stood there looking increasingly desperate. She showed the sheriff their fake badges, their phony patrol car, and played back the recording she'd made of their threats and illegal arrest attempt. Sheriff Williams examined their identification and found exactly what Margaret expected. They were private security guards hired by a company that worked for the HOA. They had no police training, no arrest authority, and no legal right to detain anyone. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Williams said to the fake officers. "You're under arrest for impersonating police officers, attempted kidnapping, and criminal threatening. You have the right to remain silent." As the real police officers handcuffed the fake ones and put them in the back of actual patrol cars, Margaret felt a mixture of satisfaction and anger. Satisfaction because justice was being served, and anger because she realized this was probably not the first time they'd tried this trick. "Sheriff," Margaret said, "I think this goes deeper than just three guys playing dress-up. Someone hired them to do this. Someone who thought they could intimidate me into giving up my property rights." Sheriff Williams nodded. "I was thinking the same thing. This looks like organized fraud to me. We're going to need to investigate everyone involved in this scheme." Margaret smiled for the first time in months. She'd been patient and tried to handle the HOA situation quietly, but they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They'd escalated from civil harassment to criminal activity, and they'd done it to someone who knew exactly how to make them pay for it. The fake officers were driven away in real police cars. Their fake patrol car was impounded as evidence, and Margaret finally felt like she had the upper hand. But this was just the beginning. Now it was time to find out who was really behind this scheme and make sure they faced the full consequences of their actions. Harrison Blackwell and his associates were about to learn what happened when you tried to bully a retired attorney general on her own property. The news of the fake police arrest spread through Millbrook County like wildfire. By evening, Margaret's phone was ringing nonstop with calls from reporters, neighbors, and old colleagues who'd heard what happened. The story was too good not to share. A retired attorney general who'd caught fake cops trying to arrest her over HOA violations. But Margaret wasn't interested in media attention. She was interested in justice. The three men who'd tried to arrest her were just hired muscle. Someone else was pulling the strings, and she intended to find out who. Sheriff Patricia Williams called Margaret the next morning with information that confirmed her suspicions. "Maggie, you're not going to believe what we found when we searched that fake patrol car." "Try me," Margaret said, settling into her kitchen chair with a cup of coffee. "They had a whole list of other properties in the area. Looks like you weren't their first target. We found files on at least a dozen other homeowners who've been getting the same kind of harassment you've been dealing with." Margaret felt her anger rising. "What kind of files?" "Photos, property records, financial information. Someone's been doing serious research on people they want to target. Most of the files are for elderly homeowners or single people living alone. People who might be easier to intimidate than someone with your background." That made sense to Margaret. Bullies always picked on people they thought couldn't fight back. They'd made a serious mistake choosing her as a target. "There's more," Sheriff Williams continued. "The security company that hired these guys? It's owned by a subsidiary of Harrison Blackwell's development company. This whole thing traces right back to your HOA president." Margaret wasn't surprised, but having proof was different from having suspicions. "What are you going to do about it?" "We're building a case, but it's complicated. Blackwell's been careful to keep his hands clean on paper. He hired the security company, they hired the fake officers. He's got layers of protection between himself and the actual crimes." Margaret smiled. She'd dealt with plenty of criminals who thought they were smarter than the law. "Patricia, I've been thinking about this all night. What if this isn't just about intimidating a few homeowners? What if there's a bigger scheme here?" "What do you mean?" "Think about it. All the properties on that list, they're all valuable pieces of land. Good locations, big lots, the kind of places a developer would want to get his hands on. What if Blackwell's been using the HOA as a weapon to force people to sell their property cheap?" Sheriff Williams was quiet for a moment. "That would be fraud on a massive scale." "Exactly. And if I'm right, we're not just talking about harassment and fake police officers. We're talking about conspiracy, extortion, maybe even racketeering." Margaret spent the rest of the day making phone calls to people she'd worked with during her time as Attorney General. She called the current Attorney General's office, the district attorney, and several federal agencies that investigated financial crimes. Everyone she talked to was very interested in what she had to say. By the end of the week, Margaret had a team of investigators working on the case. They weren't just looking at the fake police incident anymore. They were examining years of HOA activity, tracking financial records, and interviewing other homeowners who'd been targeted. What they found was even worse than Margaret had suspected. Harrison, Blackwell had been running the same scheme in 3 different counties. He'd set up HOAs in areas where he wanted to develop new properties, then used fake boundary adjustments to claim authority over existing homes. Once he controlled the HOA, he'd harass property owners with impossible demands and massive fines, until they gave up and sold their land to him at below-market prices. The fake police officers were just his latest escalation. When regular harassment didn't work fast enough, he'd hired security guards to dress up like cops and literally arrest people on fake charges. Most of his victims were so scared they'd agree to sell immediately, rather than face what they thought was criminal prosecution. Margaret discovered that over the past 5 years, Blackwell had forced at least 40 families to sell their properties. This way, he'd made millions of dollars buying land cheap and then developing it into new subdivisions. The profits from each development funded the next phase of his scheme. But Margaret wasn't content to just expose Blackwell's crimes. She wanted to help his victims and make sure he could never hurt anyone else. She filed a massive lawsuit against Blackwell, his development company, the HOA, and everyone else involved in the scheme. The lawsuit sought damages not just for herself, but for every homeowner who'd been targeted. She was asking for millions of dollars in compensation and punitive damages. More importantly, she filed complaints with every professional licensing board that had jurisdiction over Blackwell's associates. The lawyers who'd helped him file fraudulent documents faced disbarment. The real estate agents who'd helped him buy properties from intimidated sellers faced license revocation. The accountants who'd helped him hide his profits faced criminal charges. Margaret also worked with the state legislature to draft new laws protecting homeowners from HOA abuse. She testified at hearings, spoke with reporters, and used her reputation to push for stronger regulations on how HOAs could be formed and what authority they could claim over existing properties. The investigation kept uncovering new evidence of Blackwell's schemes. They found emails where he bragged about scaring old ladies into selling cheap. They found financial records showing he'd paid the fake security guards over $50,000 in the past year. They even found a training manual that taught his employees how to intimidate homeowners into compliance. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was a recording from a HOA board meeting where Blackwell explained his strategy to other board members. "We make their lives so miserable they'll pay us to go away," he said on the recording. "Most people don't know their rights, and even if they do, they can't afford to fight us in court." Margaret made sure that recording was played at every court, hearing and shared with every reporter who covered the story. As the case built momentum, more victims came forward. People who'd been too scared or embarrassed to complain before started telling their stories. There was Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow who'd sold her family home for half its value after the HOA threatened to foreclose on fake liens. There was Robert Taylor, a veteran who'd been forced to get rid of his service dog because the HOA claimed it violated pet restrictions that didn't actually exist. Each new victim made Margaret more determined to see justice done. These weren't just legal violations. They were attacks on people's homes and lives. Blackwell had deliberately targeted vulnerable people and used their fear against them. The criminal case was moving forward too. The district attorney had filed charges against Blackwell for conspiracy, fraud, and extortion. The fake police officers had already pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against their boss in exchange for reduced sentences. But Margaret's biggest victory came when the state attorney general announced a full investigation into HOA fraud across the entire state. They were using Margaret's case as a model to examine suspicious HOA activity everywhere. Other attorneys general in neighboring states started their own investigations based on the evidence Margaret had helped uncover. Margaret realized she'd stumbled onto something much bigger than one corrupt HOA president. She'd exposed a type of fraud that was probably happening in communities across the country. Unscrupulous developers were using HOAs as legal weapons to steal property from homeowners who didn't know how to fight back. The media attention was intense, but Margaret didn't mind it this time. Every news story and interview helped warn other homeowners about the schemes people like Blackwell were running. The more publicity the case got, the harder it would be for other criminals to use the same tactics. 6 months after the fake police officers had tried to arrest her in her own barn, Margaret was sitting in a federal courthouse watching Harrison Blackwell get led away in handcuffs. He'd been convicted on multiple felony charges and sentenced to 8 years in prison. But Margaret wasn't done yet. The civil lawsuit was still pending, and she was determined to get compensation for every single person Blackwell had victimized. More importantly, she wanted to make sure the laws were changed so this kind of fraud would be much harder to pull off in the future. Her quiet retirement had turned into the biggest case of her career, and she was just getting started. The courtroom was packed on the day Harrison Blackwell's sentence was announced. Margaret sat in the front row, surrounded by dozens of other victims who'd finally gotten their chance to see justice served. Mrs. Chen was there, clutching a photo of the house she'd been forced to sell. Robert Taylor sat with his service dog, who was now legally protected from any HOA interference. Families who'd lost their homes, elderly people who'd been terrorized, and neighbors who'd been turned against each other, they were all there to watch Blackwell pay for what he'd done. Judge Catherine Morrison had reviewed every piece of evidence, listened to victim testimony for 3 days, and studied the financial records that showed exactly how much money Blackwell had stolen through his schemes. When she spoke, her voice was clear and angry. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, looking directly at the man who'd once seemed so confident and powerful, "you have systematically destroyed lives and communities for your own profit. You've used fear, intimidation, and outright fraud to steal from families who trusted the legal system to protect them. The court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation." The courtroom erupted in applause. Margaret felt tears in her eyes as she watched Blackwell's shoulders slump in defeat. 12 years was more than anyone had hoped for. The judge had clearly understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about the violation of people's most basic right to feel safe in their own homes. But the criminal conviction was just the beginning. The civil lawsuit had resulted in one of the largest settlements in the state's history. Blackwell's company was ordered to pay $47 million to the victims of his schemes. Every person who'd been forced to sell their property would get full compensation based on current market values. Everyone who'd paid fraudulent fines would get their money back with interest. More importantly, the court had invalidated every single boundary adjustment and fraudulent HOA filing that Blackwell had created. Margaret's ranch was officially declared free from any HOA authority, along with dozens of other properties that had been illegally targeted. The 3 fake police officers had already been sentenced to 3 years each in state prison. The security company that hired them lost its license and was shut down permanently. Several lawyers and real estate agents who'd helped Blackwell file fraudulent documents were disbarred and faced their own criminal charges. Margaret stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing, surrounded by reporters and victims who wanted to thank her. But she kept thinking about all the people who hadn't been as lucky as she was. What if she hadn't been a retired attorney general? What if she'd been like Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow who didn't understand legal documents and was too scared to fight back? "Ms. Rodriguez," a reporter called out, "what's next for you? Are you going back to your quiet retirement?" Margaret smiled. "Quiet retirement will have to wait a little longer. This case showed me that there are probably thousands of people across the country dealing with the same kind of fraud we exposed here. I'm not going to stop until we've protected as many of them as possible." That promise led to Margaret's new career as an advocate for homeowner rights. She started a nonprofit organization called the Property Rights Defense Foundation, funded largely by her share of the settlement money. The foundation provided free legal help to homeowners dealing with abusive HOAs and fraudulent schemes. Within 2 years, Margaret's foundation had helped expose similar fraud rings in 12 different states. They'd assisted over 300 families in fighting back against illegal HOA actions. They'd also worked with state legislatures to pass stronger laws protecting homeowners from the kind of abuse Blackwell had perpetrated. The new laws Margaret helped write required HOAs to provide clear proof of their authority before taking any action against properties. They also created severe penalties for filing fraudulent boundary adjustments or using intimidation tactics against homeowners. Most importantly, they established a state hotline where people could report suspicious HOA activity for immediate investigation. Margaret's ranch became headquarters for the foundation, but it was still home to all her rescued animals. Thunder and Daisy were now joined by 6 more rescue horses, and her chicken flock had grown to 23 birds. Biscuit the pig had become something of a local celebrity after his story was featured in several news articles about the case. The vegetable stand at the end of Margaret's driveway was busier than ever. Neighbors who'd been afraid to visit during the HOA harassment now stopped by regularly, not just for vegetables but to chat and share their own stories. Mrs. Patterson had become Margaret's closest friend, helping tend the garden and care for the animals. Margaret also discovered she had a talent for public speaking. She was invited to conferences across the country to share her story and teach other people how to recognize and fight back against property fraud. Law schools invited her to lecture about elder abuse and financial crimes. Homeowner associations, the legitimate ones, asked her to speak about proper governance and legal compliance. One of her most satisfying speaking engagements was at the annual convention of the National Association of Attorneys General. Standing at the podium where she'd once sat as a member, Margaret told her colleagues about the new types of fraud they needed to watch for and the legal tools they could use to protect their citizens. Property fraud doesn't just hurt individual families, she told the audience of attorneys general. It destroys communities and undermines trust in our legal system. When criminals can use fake legal documents to steal people's homes, nobody is safe. The impact of Margaret's work went far beyond just stopping fraud. Her case had changed how HOAs operated across the country. Legitimate HOAs started being more careful about their authority and more transparent about their rules. Insurance companies began offering policies to protect homeowners from fraudulent liens and illegal fees. Real estate agents were required to take additional training about HOA laws and homeowner rights. Margaret's story also inspired other retired legal professionals to get involved in fighting property fraud. Former judges, prosecutors, and public defenders started volunteering with her foundation and similar organizations. Their experience and knowledge made them powerful advocates for people who couldn't afford expensive legal help. 3 years after the fake police officers had tried to arrest her, Margaret received a letter that made her cry happy tears. It was from a young couple in Arizona whose home had been targeted by a scheme almost identical to Blackwell's. They'd read about Margaret's case online and used the same legal strategies to fight back. Not only had they saved their house, but their complaint had led to the arrest of another corrupt developer who'd been running similar scams. "Thank you for showing us that we didn't have to be victims," they wrote. "Because of your courage, our children will grow up in the home we built for them." Margaret framed that letter and hung it in her home office, right next to the photo of Harrison Blackwell being led away in handcuffs. The ranch was peaceful again, but in a different way than before. It wasn't just Margaret's quiet retreat anymore. It was a symbol of what happened when good people refused to be bullied. Visitors came from all over the country to see the place where one woman's fight for justice had sparked a national movement. Margaret still woke up at sunrise every morning to feed her animals and tend her garden, but now she also spent her days answering emails from homeowners who needed help, reviewing legal documents for her foundation's cases, and planning new ways to protect people from property fraud. Her chicken coops were still in the same place. They'd always been, painted bright red and completely non-compliant with any HOA standards. Her vegetable stand still operated on the honor system, with a simple sign that now read, "Fresh vegetables honor system, leave money in the box, protected by the Constitution and one very stubborn, retired Attorney General." Thunder and Daisy grazed peacefully in their pasture, no longer bothered by fake security guards taking pictures through the fence. Biscuit rolled happily in his mud puddle, completely unconcerned with anyone's opinion about agricultural animals in residential areas. Margaret had gotten much more than her peaceful retirement back. She'd found a new purpose that combined everything she'd learned in her legal career with everything she'd come to love about her life on the ranch. She was protecting people's right to live peacefully in their own homes, just like she'd fought to live peacefully in hers. And somewhere in a federal prison, Harrison Blackwell was probably still wondering how his foolproof scheme had been destroyed by one woman who refused to be intimidated. Margaret hoped he had plenty of time to think about it.